Welcome back, young scholars. In this video, we will be discussing global commerce in the period 1450 to 1750. We'll spend most of our time focused on the silver trade, and as we'll find out, contrary to that song, life was not fine down in the silver mines. The big questions we should be able to answer after watching the video are: first, how did the flow of silver lead to the development of a new global economy? Second, what is mercantilism and how did it impact global trade? Third, what were the effects of the development of a new global economy? First, how did the flow of silver lead to the development of a new global economy? During this first global age, this major transformation occurs in the period 1450 to 1750, where we're starting to see the development of long distance oceanic trade. This image shows some of the log books that were kept. This is the Spanish routes, so we can see some of the places in the Americas, including the Caribbean, Florida, South America, that the Spanish were traveling to. This image shows British ship routes, so we can see the 13 colonies. The British are also coming over here into the Indian Ocean region, starting to do some colonizing in India by the time we get to 1750. And then finally, the Dutch are also coming around Africa, spending some time in the Indian Ocean region, starting to take control over Indonesia. What are some of the goods that are being traded in this emerging network of global exchange? First, we have goods like sugar. So sugar, highly demanded in places like Europe, the Middle East. It was being grown in this period predominantly in the Americas, in places like the Caribbean and Brazil, using labor predominantly from Africa. A second good involved in global exchange was fur. Fur was available in colder climates in places like North America or in Russia, Siberia. It's where you had people trapping furs and then taking that good and selling it most often to places like China and Europe, where in this period from 1450 to 1750, fur becomes a very hot commodity. And then finally, the item that really makes global exchange work is silver. Silver was increasingly being used as a global currency, as something that would facilitate exchange between different regions. The Spanish, they would create these pieces of 8, these silver coins. The Spanish press, who was creating those coins, they had a little logo, which is this scroll and pillars, which if you push it together is actually this dollar symbol. So silver was mined in the Spanish colony, places like Potosi in Latin America. We have indigenous peoples who were in these systems of forced or forced labor. We talked about the continuation of the mita system by the Spanish, a system that was first developed by the Incan, and that was how this silver was mined. Now the conditions were not good at all. You can see images like this show the mines, dark, crowded, dreary place where these miners were doing their work. In this period of 1450 to 1750, Europe still has a high demand for East and South Asian luxury goods, whether it's porcelains or silk or ivory. There are certain goods that are coming out of South and East Asia that Europeans still want to get their hands on. And we had mentioned that up to this point, Europe really didn't have a good that South and East Asia was particularly interested in. Well, now they do, and that good was silver. So there was increased demand, especially in China, for silver. You can kind of think of China as being like this giant vacuum cleaner, and it's just sucking up silver as quickly as they possibly can. Now, one of the reasons for this was in the Ming Dynasty in the 1600s. They changed from requiring taxes, which used to be paid in kind, which would be goods like, for instance, rice, to now requiring all taxes to be paid in silver. Remember, the Mongols had used paper money, which the Chinese had first developed, but did it poorly in the Yuan dynasty. And so the Ming are starting to realize we maybe need to have a little bit more thoughtful approach to our economy and our currency. And so they start requiring taxes to be paid in silver, which just meant the average everyday Chinese peasant needed to get their hands on it in order to be able to pay their taxes, which just meant the demand for silver is going way, way up. Europeans' role in this increasing global commerce is that they were involved in transporting the goods. They had the ships. They were the truck drivers of this period. And the trucks that they were hauling goods around in are the caravels and the carracks especially, that the Portuguese, the Spanish had developed. So we can see here a map showing the various routes that these European powers were taking to get access to the silver, which was mostly, again, in the case of the Spanish, coming out of mines down here in Latin America and then being brought over here to Asia. And that worked well if you were the Spanish, because you had access to some of the mines that were in South America and in Mexico. However, if you were the Portuguese or you were the Dutch, there were no silver mines for the Portuguese, for instance, in Brazil. The Dutch didn't have access to silver mines, so where are they going to get silver? Well, there's one other place where silver is being mined in any significant quantity, and that is in Japan. And so what these other rival European players, like the Dutch and the Portuguese, started doing was to come over, sail around Africa, sail over to Japan, and pick up silver from Japan in their boats and bring it over to China, where they would sell it to the Chinese in exchange for those East Asian luxury goods that they wanted to get their hands on. So the Dutch, the Portuguese, they were getting silver from Japan and taking it to China. So the role that the European states are playing is more as a facilitator and mover of those goods. Now the Spanish, again, had their own ships. They had access to their own silver coming out of the mines of places like Potosi. And one of the places that they would haul this silver to was their colony in Asia, the Philippines. So remember, the Spanish had colonized the Philippines in the late 1500s. And they would send these ships, which are known as Manila galleons. They were loaded down with silver over to the Philippines. And then what would happen is the Chinese would bring their boats over to the Philippines and they would pick up some of the silver. And that's where the trade would take place, right here in the Philippines. And this city, Manila, was the place where a lot of this silver was being exchanged. Makes sense that there would probably be some competition, as some of the people like the French and the British recognize, wow, the Spanish have a ton of silver, they're hauling it across the ocean, including the Atlantic Ocean. Maybe we could stop some of those ships, board them, and steal their silver. And so we start to see increased piracy taking place, especially in the Caribbean region. As the French and the British started to gain control of various islands in the Caribbean, we start to see increased piracy taking place in those places. And the Disney version, Pirates of the Caribbean, is completely historically inaccurate and misleading, but there is some small kernel of truth in the sense that there was competition over these trade routes, which led to increased piracy in that particular region in this period. So what is mercantilism and how did it impact global trade? As global trade increases, governments recognize, look, we need to take a greater role in economic affairs. And an economic theory develops predominantly in Western Europe between 1450 and 1750, and it's known as mercantilism. As we think about economics, talking about the way in which goods are produced, exchanged, and also the role that the government plays in those economic decisions. And one way to think about that is put that on a spectrum, where on the one hand you could have the state playing as little a role as possible. We refer to that as free market economics. Later on, we'll talk about the economic theory of Adam Smith known as capitalism that suggested this is the role that government should be taking when it comes to those economic decisions. On the other hand, though, you have what's known as a command economy, where the economic decisions are increasingly made by the state. Now, we tend to think, when we think about command economies, of like socialism, communism, where the goal of the state is to create greater equality. But that doesn't necessarily have to be the goal. And in fact, mercantilism is more of a command form of economy because states are increasingly making many of the most important economic decisions. But the purpose behind mercantilism is different. It's not to make everyone equal. Instead, it's to make wealth for your state. Nations believe they could do this by developing a favorable balance of trade. We think about the way in which states trade, right? You have the goods that you are exporting, the goods that you are selling, and then the goods you are importing, the goods that you are bringing in. And the idea behind mercantilism is, look, you want to be able to export more goods than you're importing. The thought being that the more goods you sell, you got more money coming in than you have money going out. One way that a mercantilist would approach this or sort of think about this is, look, especially if we could buy the imports really cheaply, if we could develop cheap raw materials, which, oh, by the way, we could get from our colonies. One of the reasons why colonization may have been such an attractive option for European countries at this time was that they were following this mercantilist approach. They recognized, look, we can get cheap raw materials out of our colonies. We can then manufacture, process the goods into what is maybe refined sugar, and then turn around and sell that export, maybe even back to our colonies at a higher price. The colonies provided raw materials and markets for finished goods, and that's why mercantilism and colonization go hand in hand. And then finally, in terms of, well, how do you know that you're making wealth for your society? That was measured in metal coinage, what you call bullion, whether it was gold coins or silver coins, which we know certain European players like the Spanish had a lot of. And the thinking was, look, the more wealth in the form of bullion, the more likely we are to be able to raise a strong military, because we can pay for soldiers and we can build ships. One way that European states were able to manage and control their economies was through the creation of something called the joint stock company. Joint stock companies work in some ways the same way that modern day corporations work. Essentially, the joint stock company was the precursor of the modern corporation. There's some similarities between the two, but there's also some significant differences. In terms of similarities, on the one hand, joint stock companies, their purpose, their existence was to trade, just like modern corporations. The difference, though, is that joint stock companies were given the exclusive power by the government to engage in a certain type of trade. So they were given the exclusive right to go to a certain place and trade a certain object or certain item. For example, there was a company that the British established called the Royal African Company. And the purpose of the Royal African Company was to go down to the west coast of Africa to pick up slaves in their ships and haul them across the Middle Passage to the West Indies and to other British colonies where they were sold. And the government created these charters, these documents, which gave the Royal African Company the exclusive right to engage in this trade. Essentially, they created monopolies to exclusively have that right to trade. Another difference that we can identify is that these joint stock companies were also given the right or the power to raise an army, to make war, and to essentially govern. So in some ways, they acted a little bit like a state themselves. A few of these joint stock companies you may be familiar with. One of them was called the Virginia Company. Another was called the Massachusetts Bay Company. These joint stock companies came over to North America and they established company colonies. Eventually, they would turn into our modern day states of Virginia and Massachusetts. But that shows you, again, a little bit different how these joint stock companies were functioning. It would almost be as if a modern corporation like Best Buy and their Geek Squad was an army that was making war and going out and trying to take over other shops in the mall. There are two very powerful joint stock companies that you should be familiar with. One is the British East India Company. It was established by the British to go to India to begin to trade for all those Indian goods, all those spices, tea, cotton. And what initially started as a company that was designed to go and trade, eventually over time, the British East India Company started gaining more and more territorial control over India, to the point where by the 1700s, the British East India Company essentially controlled the vast majority of what is today modern India. Another important joint stock company was the Dutch East India Company, or the VOC. They were developed to establish exclusive control over the spice trade. And just how wealthy and powerful was the Dutch East India Company? You see this image showing you $7.9 trillion was the estimated net worth of the Dutch East India Company in 1637. That equates basically to the 20 most valuable modern corporations today. And that shows you just how incredibly valuable spices were at the time. Now, where are these spices located? Primarily in Southeast Asia. The modern day islands of Indonesia is where the Dutch East India Company established colonial control. And what kind of spices were they looking for? Spices like nutmeg and pepper. The third big question we should be able to answer is, how did the development of global commerce impact existing transregional trade networks? The existing transregional trade routes, like the Silk Road or the Indian Ocean Sea Lanes or the Trans-Saharan Network, continued to exist, but they did experience some major changes and disruptions. Let's start with the Silk Road. The Silk Road, an overland trade network, its importance diminished over time, partly because it's simply easier to ship and move goods over water and maritime trade. Well, that does not mean that the Silk Road just disappeared. There are still cities today that have marketplaces, and that trade still takes place among various pastoral nomadic groups and other peoples across that band of Inner Asia. But its relative importance in this period too, from 1450 to 1750, is going to be in decline. In terms of the Indian Ocean network, the major change or transformation is the addition of Europeans. In the late 1400s and then into the 1500s, the Portuguese begin establishing a trade post empire with their gunships, and through naval warfare and through taxation, they are able to establish control over certain important strategic spots, including, do you remember the Swahili coast states in East Africa? The Portuguese showed up with their large gunboats and they destroyed those cities and towns to strategically control and establish colonies, but not too far inland, just on the coastal regions of East Africa. In terms of the trans-Saharan trade network, the major transformation in West Africa is, again, the arrival of European merchants, starting with the Portuguese on the west coast of Africa. And how is that going to impact this inland network? The focus of trans-Saharan trade begins to shift more towards the coast, to those Atlantic ports, with the arrival of the Portuguese and then later the Dutch, the British. The states that had formed in that region, remember we talked in prior to 1200, there was a major kingdom there called Ghana, and then later we talked about an empire in period 1 from 1200 to 1450 called Mali. Well, as we move into period 2, there was an empire that had started to form called Songhai in that same region of West Africa. So Ghana, pre-period 1, Mali, period 1, and then Songhai is as we move into period 2. It was a West African empire. It's going to be very similar in terms of its characteristics to Mali and Ghana, following in that Islamic tradition, using the religion of Islam to legitimize the power of the ruler. But that empire is going to be weakened as trade on the trans-Saharan network becomes less important. As Atlantic maritime trade picks up, trans-Saharan trade weakens, leading to a weakening of the Songhai Empire. Eventually, there are going to be some Moroccans who have guns, and they are going to invade the Songhai Empire because they're looking for gold. They don't actually find much gold, but we're going to see the defeat of one of those major kingdoms in West Africa. Now, in terms of the interactions between Europeans and the people of the west coast of Africa, it's important to recognize there were kingdoms that had been established in the west coast of Africa that were thriving and prosperous kingdoms like Ashanti. The Europeans are going to establish trade relationships on the west coast, this little region right here, known as the Gold Coast. The Portuguese and the British are looking to establish connections with those kingdoms. And they're strong kingdoms, like the kingdom of Ashanti. Now, Ashanti is a fascinating kingdom. There's this story among the people of Ashanti that this golden stool descended from the heavens and given to the person who then used that stool to legitimize his power. So this is the golden stool. Notice the golden stool actually has its own chair because the golden stool is not, ironically enough, allowed to touch the ground. But this is just one other way that rulers throughout world history have used either objects of art or architecture in order to bolster or legitimize their power. This is kind of a cool one, this golden stool. We go further down the west coast of Africa, we run into the Kingdom of Congo. That was another strong Central African kingdom. They also established a trade relationship with the Portuguese, and in the process of that trade relationship, the people of the Congo, in particular, there was a certain king, decided to convert to the religion of the Portuguese, which was Christianity. Around 1500, the people of the Congo converted to Christianity, which caused Christianity to spread across that region of sub-Saharan Africa. And certainly the Portuguese sent priests and missionaries down to that region, and that sort of furthered the conversion and spread. And that is one of the reasons why today we look at a map showing the predominant religion of Africa. We see Islam in northern Africa, remember, spread predominantly by way of the initial expansion of the Islamic Empire and then to West Africa along those trans-Saharan trade networks. Well, we could talk about the spread of Christianity in this region of sub-Saharan Africa, starting really around 1500 with the arrival of the Portuguese and the conversion of the King of Congo to Christianity. The big questions you should be able to answer after watching this video. First, how did the flow of silver lead to the development of a new global economy? Second, what is mercantilism and how did it impact global trade? And third, how did the development of global commerce impact existing trans-regional trade networks? As always, thanks for watching.